Welcome to episode 38 of Out of Bounds, a podcast where I give my social commentary on topics in today's society. I'm your host, Terry, and today we're talking about, I believe her name is pronounced Halle Bailey, being cast as Ariel in the Little Mermaid live action movie. So if you haven't heard, a young singer / actress who I believe is of African American descent or partially was cast to play Ariel, the mermaid, in the Disney's live action adaptation of The Little Mermaid, or to play Ariel, sorry. So anyway, this caused a lot of backlash online, as you would assume. People that are just ignorant to the topics, people that are just trolling, trying to, create fights, and people that are trying to defend it. So all that good stuff. But I'll say off the top, I have no problem with the casting. And so if you've paid attention or if you listen to some of my other movie-related, casting-related type discussions, you will know how I feel about this, and I'll just reiterate it. But number one, for me, when you're talking about switching race or gender and any of that, to me, it comes down to the character or the story. And so I've heard other people with this opinion as well. It comes down to, is that essential to the character or to the story? And more times than not, it is. And so if it is something that's essential to the character or the story as we know it, then you trying to tell that story while switching the race or the gender doesn't make sense to me. That's what I would call bad writing. Because if you telling me that this character is going to go through a certain set of circumstances and you switch the character's gender or race and they still do the exact same actions, that's not believable to me. You're not going to be the same person. Whoever you are, if you grew up the opposite gender or if you grew up a different ethnicity than you grew up, you're not going to think and do the same things. You're going to have a very different life. And so that for me becomes lazy writing to just say, okay, it doesn't matter who's this character or what this character's background is, they're going to react this way. That's not how we see the world. We experience the world through our identity. And so this was similar to what I was saying about Superman. And again, when it comes down to that, if you want to tell a completely different story, you say, yeah, okay, if Superman appeared to be African American, then we're going to tell that story because that's going to give us a whole different story. Well, in that case, to me, just make a new character. If you got such a fresh story, then make a new character. It doesn't have to be the same IP. And so that's how I feel about that certain aspect. But for Little Mermaid, this is not one of those times. You're talking about a mermaid, a fictional creature. And so you say the cartoon, she was portrayed as white, let's just say. I'm not even going to really use the race because she's a mermaid. She doesn't have a race. She's not real. And so if you were to switch the portrayal to make it look as if she's white, black, Asian, whatever, it's not going to change anything because they're underwater. They don't live by our society and by the race thing. Would that change things when she came on land? Yes, that would change things. But for the most part, you're talking about a mermaid. And so for me, I don't think there's a big issue with switching the background of the character or of the actor portraying the character. And so I had these conversations back and forth with people online. And what I realized, especially after today, long heated debate with just a real goof person, but me and him cool. But what that conversation made me realize is that people often in these conversations mix up the conversation of representation and the whole story and casting. So people conflate those and put those two things together. And I believe those are two very separate conversations. If you want to talk about my feelings on representation, that's going to be a very long conversation and very different from you asking about my feelings on if a character is essential to be one certain type of race or gender. And so I don't think it helps. It just confuses the subject when you try to put those two things together. And that's often what happens in debates. People are throwing multiple things into the conversation. And so now people are speaking about one thing while this person is thinking about this. And so what you get is an argument in a circle because nobody understands each other and you're mixing up two different conversations. I think those conversations should and could be had separately. And so with this, we're talking about representation because some people, their quick reaction when someone says they shouldn't change the race, they say, well, Disney's had all these princesses and we only had one black princess, or it was powerful for people to see themselves. And okay, I've made my feelings on representation clear before, but the point is that conversation does not answer the question brought up by people saying they shouldn't change the race. And then the people that want the race to stay the same, they like to talk about how it was portrayed in the original. Some people are doing stupid stuff, talking about the science of mermaids being European and like Caucasian. That's ridiculous. But even then, you still just got these people just talking about being accurate to the adaptation, all that stuff. So now you're talking about the movie. You're talking about the character. You're talking about the story. But then you got other people talking about representation. And now it's all getting mixed into one conversation. I think people got to realize, what is it that you are upset about or trying to defend, and understand what that falls into. So for me, again, my initial reaction is not, oh, you got to represent black people or change it, so we can have different people on screen. I don't really care about that. For me, my initial reaction, well, okay, Ariel's a mermaid. Does she have to look like this? No, she doesn't, because she's a fictional creature and she lives underwater. Okay, cool. That's me looking at the story and the character. The example, as I said, with Superman could be applied to any other hero or any other character. So like I was using the example earlier, if you wrote a story that takes place in Nazi Germany and you had the same character in two different versions of the story, one version the character is a German, and the other version the character is African American, that's two very different stories. And if you wrote it to be the exact same story, then that's lazy and bad writing. Because the fact is that context is going to matter. Now, that's a real world story, of course. And so that makes it more pertinent to be, not to be accurate. It's not like to say, oh, there was no black people in Germany. That's not what I'm saying. What I'm saying is that character's identity is going to drive their decisions. And if it doesn't, that's bad writing. And so I don't believe a character being African American or German would have the exact same reactions in that situation. And so that's what I talk about. Even if you want to talk about Batman, people say, well, does Batman have to be Caucasian? And no, he doesn't. I don't think that's integral to his character. What's integral to Batman's character is the tragedy and his access to financial wealth. Does that mean only Caucasian people in financial wealth? No, because if Batman was always set in the 1920s, okay, then we can have that conversation. But the fact is, Batman lives in the modern day. And so can you have a billionaire African-American family or Asian family? Of course you can. So would I be super opposed to Batman being displayed or portrayed by a different race? No, not at all, because that doesn't change who Batman is per se, because Batman is very simple into the fact of his story. And so that goes back to Ariel and Little Mermaid. The story of an underwater creature is not going to be affected by what race you think they are. And for people that are saying it's going to, trigger me or it's going to be different, the thing is, you got to suspend your disbelief with movies. That's the visual medium. So understanding with CGI, with casting, with historical accuracy, with all these things, anything could mess up your suspension of disbelief, and now you just out of the movie. But once again, to say it's different than the original, that's going to take me out of the movie. Well, then I would just point at any live action remake they've done. Not everything is beat for beat the same. There's a lot of stuff that's the same, but there's changes. And so do you say, oh no, that change just took me out of the movie? Not really. I mean, it's going to be different for each person, but not really. By and large, it's the same character. And so for me, again, there's always that third option of people just being mad at this because she's not Caucasian or European American. And they try to mask it with other excuses. That is unacceptable as well. So, but you can't really tell somebody. All you can do is have a conversation, and if they can back up what they're saying, then, you know, they're telling the truth. And if they can't, they could just be trying to hide behind that excuse. And then the last thing I'll say about it, this whole thing about whitewashing, racism, all that, and I've talked about it before, and I'll talk about it again. There are times where I agree, like about things like affirmative action, all those things, that it is what it is. But discrimination, prejudice is not the same as racism. And this is not semantics or a vocab lesson. It's just not the same. And I understand that the term is watered down. It doesn't hold as much significance. People call people racist for anything. And so people don't really understand the real definition and power of racism, which is built in power. And there's only one group in power. But not to that point, to the point to say, again, why is it okay then or why is it not okay if we make Princess Tiana from Princess and the Frog? How come we don't make her a different character or different portrayed by a different race? And again, some people try to turn this to a black and white argument. And I'm like, I feel like that's different, not because she's black, but she's a real human character in a certain time, in a certain part of the country. And they're displaying a certain part of that city where not the aesthetic, but the environment is very African American. And the way she reacts in her circumstances is driven by her being African American, because that's just the development of the character. That's her psychosis. And so, yes, there's other people besides African American people in New Orleans at that time. However, if you were to do the exact same story and stick a character in there that wasn't African American, it would be a very different character. Not because they look different, because they would react different. And that's what people don't understand. Like, if you stuck somebody in my life that wasn't African American and had them live through my life, they would go about it very differently than I did, because we are all developed by our identities. That's the way we experience the world. And so, yes, I would say for Princess Tiana in general, or specifically, that would be integral to her character, into the story. Same thing with Pocahontas. Someone tried to tell me they would have a Caucasian actor play Pocahontas. Like, and it just blows my mind how silly people sound. And it's just like, well, you're being racist if you don't think anyone could play anybody. That's absolutely silly. That's absolutely silly, because that goes back to suspension of disbelief. Not being politically correct, it goes back to suspension of disbelief. And so if I'm sitting here watching a story about Native Americans prior to being colonized, and the lead character is a Native American, but she's a Caucasian woman, it's going to be very hard to suspend my disbelief at that point. And that's an important part of the movie. And so, no, absolutely not. We know English people can play American actors and so on and so forth. But that's very different, because you portraying somebody that you could pass for. But that's not how it works if you just get to play or you get anyone to play any type of historical figure. That's just not how that works. If they got Chadwick Boseman to play Abraham Lincoln, I would say that's a problem as well. Your suspension of disbelief won't be there. And so movies is a hobby. It's fun. I love movies. Unfortunately, a lot of times politics get brought into it, but Hollywood is political as well. So I can't blame people, but people really mix up politics with just what is actual needed for a movie. And so I'm not talking about representation of they never did this, so they need to do this. Not talking about that. I'm not talking about, oh, well, you can only do this, but white people can't do this. No, we're not talking about that racing. We're talking about characters and story, what's necessitated by the story and the character. So anyway, go to the comment section. Let me know what you think about the cast and share it around. Get the conversation started. Thumbs up, subscribe, and thank you for listening.